So I'm going to talk a little bit in the next, I don't know, 45 minutes, hour, something like that, about the future of agility, about Scrum turning 25, and hopefully share with you some experiences and some stories and some aspirations as to how the future of Scrum goes. Oh, let me, um, now, we all know who Scrum.org is. I'm not going to bore you with this. Certification and training. We have a community of about 340 PSTs started by my friend and boss. Being a product owner of Scrum when your boss invented it isn't perhaps the easiest job in the world. I just want to put that out there. Ken Schwaber. So super exciting organization. We obviously live and breathe Agile and Scrum and have quite a lot of experience over these 25 years that hopefully I'll be able to share with you. So if it was last year and I was doing a presentation, I would be talking about how the world is crazy. It's changing. It's ever changing. Amazon moved into the healthcare business in the United States. The share price of the largest pharmaceutical companies, the largest distribution, pharmacies dropped, CVS and Walgreens. The fact that GE, a powerhouse, currently is trading less than $10 a share. The fact that every single retailer is closed. The fact that even the next generation of organizations like Facebook are under pressure from the government and from their own staff around the future. But I don't need to do any of that, because we have something called COVID-19. Actually, just before this talk, I just pulled up my little app because I had a test yesterday for COVID, and I am negative. So that's good news for me and my family. But we live in very changeable times, and I have some particular stories around how COVID and Scrum sort of intersect that are very personal that I'll share later. Yeah. 2020 has definitely not been, I don't know about you in Bosnia, you're probably handling it much better than the United States, but it definitely hasn't been the most straightforward of years. I'm in the office today. I'm the only person in the office today. And I've been in like 3 or 4 times since March 13th. And when I come in, on the whiteboard is our plans for 2020. We were just doing a review in February and in January, actually. And I look at them and I like shake my head, because honestly, we aren't doing those things now. You can imagine we're an in-person training organization. We pivoted to live virtual training over the last 6 months. We've continuously run sprint after sprint to pivot our materials, to use Mural, to use Zoom breakout rooms, how liberating structures work, all these techniques and tools we've been applying. That was not the plan for 2020, though ultimately I think we've ended up with a fantastic learning experience for our students, but it was not on the cards for this year. And I'm sure that many of you are in the same situation. You're sitting there thinking, these are the things I was gonna do, and now this is what I ended up doing, hey? From your basement or from your spare room with your children running around. So this isn't, I suppose, a surprise. This is a guy that I really, really like, Thomas Friedman. He writes for the Washington Post and New York Times. He's written a few books. Perhaps his most famous book is The World is Flat, that described the impact of globalization. I think we all appreciate globalization today, as it becomes almost impossible to get in Boston and the areas, hot tubs, drywall, plasterboard, as we call it in Europe, I guess. All of these things have become impossible because predominantly they're built in different countries. There's, quarantines, etc. So he's famous for that book. But he talked in his latest book called Thank You for Being Late, which is a fantastic book apart from the last 2 chapters. He talks about the fact that we're in this sort of like this supernova of change because of the market. Digital globalization is fundamentally changing how things are bought, the prices, where value is really provided. Mother Nature, which of course you could argue that COVID is a great example of Mother Nature saying, hey, you thought you were cool, I'm cooler. That goes without saying. And, whether you agree or disagree with climate change, the reality, in particularly in California and Colorado at the moment, here in the US, the wildfires are insane. And there's definitely changing climate that's affecting that, whether it's man-made or not. And then, of course, you've got the exponential, increase of computing power. And if you saw SpaceX launched more satellites the other day, I drove to work. I actually didn't drive most of the way. I had fortunate enough to have a Tesla, and it was on auto drive on the highway continuously. The fact that we live in this world where computing power is increasing exponentially. Another person that writes about this is Khalida Perez. She's actually at London School of Economics, but she's from Venezuela. And she talks about all of the ages that we're going through. And she describes, this is actually inspired by it. We've changed a few things here to make it so it's more applicable to the context that we're talking about. However, it's inspired by the work that she does. She talks about Industrial Revolution, age of steam, steel, and then currently we're still in the age of oil and mass production. And we're sort of going through this installation period to move to the next stage, which is called digital. Now, if you look at her current writing, she talks a lot about COVID-19 being a tipping point to this deployment age around this digital age. And she describes some of the characteristics of it, particularly, the working from home, the use of digital technology, the fact that you don't go to the cinema anymore, the fact that Netflix, is doing better than most cinema chains for sure. The way in which the world is changed because of COVID, and she doesn't believe we'll ever go back to the way we were. She also believes that government, for the first time, understands the importance of, for instance, internet for everybody. That's something that a lot of our states are now appreciating, with the fact that most of their kids are working from home, learning from home, that suddenly infrastructure around the internet is incredibly important. And so all of these thoughts are changing it. Now, if you believe what she says, we should go into then a deployment period, which should be awesome. But we'll wait and see. So what does it mean to change? Because when Scrum was invented, and don't worry, I'm going to come back a lot to Scrum, and we're going to talk mostly about Scrum. This just really sets the scene. When Scrum was invented over 30 years ago, and then it was obviously written up and presented, and we have a special celebration today. So, but I'll come to that in a second. When it was invented, it was certainly in response to the fact that software development was being treated like mass production, like the phrase that obviously was popular at that time was called the waterfall. This way of traditional project managing the development of complex things, which software projects tend to be incredibly complex. So, the age of mass production, the age of oil and mass production, what are the characteristics and how are they different to this next age, which I believe, and I'm going to talk a lot about this in a moment, that Scrum is fundamentally part of this new age, or certainly agile mindset and this approach to work. So we're talking about long-term planning and investment, short-term profit, efficiency, because it's all about scarcity, specialization of labor, process control, management, and king. Now, the new word, I'm going to start at the bottom because I think this is the place that's super interesting, which is management is no longer the most important person on a project. In fact, if you believe servant leadership and the ideas of Management 3.0, ultimately, my job as a CEO of Scrum.org is to help other people be successful, not ultimately for them to make me successful, which is crazy. It's like it's upside down. Just as I got into this position, everything flipped. Not sure I like it. The other thing that's interesting is we historically have cared very deeply about process control. Now, the problem with process control is when it hits a situation that people haven't seen before, that is unusual, right? Then the processes can't support that. Variance is a real challenge. So in response, complex work tends to encourage self-organization, decentralization, teams having a very loose and simple process, and then making it up every sprint or every period of time, continuously improving that. Specialization of labor, cross-functional teams. And these now, increasingly as we go up, it becomes harder. That's what we're seeing in the impact of Scrum in most organizations. We see railing against, well, I'm a coder, or I'm a marketing professional. How you're telling me to do some, I don't know, promotion stuff, or helping with some graphic design, or what the heck? The idea the most agile teams are the ones that are the most flexible. No surprise there, right? Cross-functional teams at the heart. And then innovation opportunity versus scarcity. The fact that I have a website that over 1 million people come to every month, that's running on AWS, and costs me, actually it cost me a little bit more since COVID, so because more people are coming, but about $1,800 a month. Isn't that crazy? I mean, we can do anything we want to do today. And I have some COVID stories around that in a moment. So the reality of the modern world is that historically, in the industrial mindset, we used to look at this sort of, the unknown was at the start, you would smash it, get rid of it, small team working on it, that's called R&D, and then you would make it big, right? Efficiency would increase, change would be nominal. This is the world we live in now. We live in a world where change is the ultimate reality. You build a piece of software, and I'm just using software as an analogy. Obviously, Scrum is now used in a lot of other places. You build a piece of software, you deploy it, you start using it. People are loving it. 10 minutes later, they've all moved to something else. You're like, hang on, what is happening? The reality is that you have to be continuously releasing frequently innovation to the market to both deliver value, but also to understand how that market perceives the world. And obviously, there's models that describe this world that we're moving to. Ralph Stacey, this is inspired, it's called the Stacey model. He doesn't actually like this now, and he doesn't like the way we use it, but we're still going to use it because it really makes perfect sense. The fact that requirements and technology are in this position of not really knowing what we want, not really knowing how we're going to deliver it, and we're in this sort of complex world. The Cynefin, this is the old version of Cynefin. Obviously, Dave Snowden is an incredibly smart guy. I understand about 5% of what he talks about, but really he talks about the fact that I believe, most of the work that we live in now tends to be complex or complicated. And that's when empirical process is the most important, as opposed to defined process, which tends to live in the simple and a bit of complicated world. Now, no surprise, one of the most important characteristics of Scrum is empirical process, right? That's, when we look at Scrum and we look at the success, one of the most important elements of that is to say, well, we don't know everything, but what we do know is this. Let's focus on those small things. Let's deliver some value. Let's learn it, and let's continuously inspect and adapt around it. Now, Scrum is the framework that has sort of taken off over the last 25 years and has become the standard way of approaching agile projects. Interestingly, today, though, is a super special day. Today, Scrum actually turns 25. The first abstract, the first paper written, though Jeff Sutherland in particular talks about using Scrum a lot earlier than 25 years ago. He talks about it being used in many of the organizations he was at. He didn't write it down. And obviously, as an Englishman, I say, if you don't write it down, it doesn't exist. And now, obviously, it has to be on the internet to exist. So you have to write it down and get it on the internet, then it exists. So 25 years ago at Upslar in Austin, Texas, 25 years ago today, a little bit later than now. So this was, Ken was probably still in bed getting ready for his presentation. Ken Schwaber presented, based on the work that he and Jeff had done, a paper called the Scrum Development Process. You'll notice that Scrum there is in uppercase because when I asked Ken why it was in uppercase, he said, because nobody knew it, so I had to shout. I don't know if that's true. But I guess because he was competing with the process that I was developing and working on called the Rational Unified Process. I was a product manager of that, though. At that point, RUP wasn't quite out. It was probably about a year away, and to be what it ended up being, called the RUP, and that was in capital letters, right? So I guess that makes a big difference. So, and if you want to read the original paper, you can. It's on Scrum.org's website, Scrum Development Process. Go and have a look in the resources. You can also type UPSLA, and it'll pop up, and it's really interesting because it is not Scrum that we have today. It's a different sort of Scrum, but it's got many of the same characteristics. And what's interesting is over this 25 years, those characteristics haven't changed. The emphasis has. Some of you may have heard that there may be a release of a new Scrum guide in the near future. But one thing that's interesting about all of these, and that's Jeff and Ken's domain, so I can't really speak of it, but from my experience of all the Scrum guides that have been released, the ultimately Scrum stayed the same. It's how we describe it and where the emphasis has changed over these last 25 years. Because Scrum has become, thanks to you, super successful. So I'd like to thank all of you that are sitting in there in this conference today virtually. You know, over 500,000 people trained, over 100 books with Scrum in the title. And it's in, you know, if you look at SAFe, if you look at LESS, if you look at DAD, if you look at any of these processes, they are, Scrum is at the center of them because it's probably one of the most effective and simple ways of organizing a team to focus on a backlog and a goal and continuously, empirically deliver value to customers. And of course, scrumguides.org, it's available for free for everybody. It's translated into a lot of different languages and is being practiced throughout the world. So when we look at Scrum today, the fundamental ideas of Scrum haven't changed over these 25 years. At the heart is this idea of empirical process. Interestingly, Ken brought that to Scrum because of his work with our friends at DuPont, where he said, well, look at the situation I'm in. And they said, well, empirical process is the only way to work there. Self-managed empowered teams and continuous delivery, which Jeff really brought from his experience around lean and his work at Harvard. So these things came together into this process framework that has fundamentally changed the world. Now, what's interesting is still today, we have problems with these three. You know, you look at empirical process, the ability to effectively plan at a high level, yes, in the future, but then focus in detail on small chunks and then replan continuously. You know, the one thing that confuses a lot of people about Scrum ultimately is that Scrum is not a release life cycle. Yes, you release stuff during it. That's great, but ultimately it's a planning life cycle. That's the concept of a sprint is a planned element. The sprint review is to look at your work, to learn from it, so that you can then feed that back into your learning for the next sprint. So empirical process still challenges many people. Self-managed empowered teams, we still rail a little bit about these empowered teams because, you know, we're in industrial organizations, we're getting promoted, and ultimately my success is hoarding knowledge, not sharing knowledge. And organizations are changing that. We're going to talk in detail about that in a moment. And then continuous improvement, that connects to the empowerment. It's hard to be in a continuous improvement life cycle and to be always focused on, could we do that better? I know here at scrum.org, we find it very challenging some days. And we end up sort of like, do we have to think about improving? We've barely got this working now. So, however, these things are being practiced. What's interesting about the future, and I'm calling it professionalism, but you don't have to call it professionalism, is that what tends to happen when Scrum scales, when you look at, you know, the Spotify model, when you look at organizations like SpaceX, when you look at Tesla, when you look at organizations that are being very successful, our friends at the Broad Institute, you know, the CRISPR guys, all of these organizations that are being successful, what they have done is they've added a few things to it. What they've done is they've added what I'm calling professionalism, but you can call it scaling, you can call it, I don't know what you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. To make it, to harden Scrum and to build an environment around Scrum and agile practices that make it successful. And what we look at here is four things. something around culture. I call it values, behaviors, that's sort of like the how we behave with each other to create an environment that supports transparency, that allows learning, that allows focus, those things. Discipline, super important. One thing that's, that I find the most successful organizations are ridiculously disciplined, and that manifests itself in many places. In the case of software teams, it means done is done. It means that work, continuous delivery, TDD, those sort of things become very front and center. For organizations that aren't software teams, it means they're very maniacal about describing outcomes in their product backlogs, which then leads us to the next one, which is outcome oriented. And that's kind of missing, I think, from the Scrum Guide, or maybe we'll see what happens in the next few months, because, that ultimately you're doing this for somebody. You're not doing this for yourselves. You're doing it to deliver some level of change. And the last point is something that I learned a lot from looking at organizations like Spotify, but also from the more intelligent, more grown-up organizations around people development. The fundamental need, and Toyota, this is at the heart of Toyota, to help others to develop. So let's talk about those 4 things and really talk about how Scrum is gonna, I see Scrum and the ideas of Scrum scaling in organizations as we go forward after these last 25 years. So the last release of the Scrum Guide was 2007. And one thing that was really exciting about that release was we added the values, or Ken and Jeff added the values, and then we, I guess, drew lots of posters about them. And really the reason why now, this is an interesting point. I just want to share a story from talking to Ken about this. So Ken hates prescriptive process and methodology. And he hates it not because he doesn't like telling people what to do, quite the reverse. What he hates it for is because he doesn't believe that he knows enough. Every situation is slightly different. So the Scrum that's in the Scrum Guide is the essence, this just it. So adding the values was really interesting because he kept saying, and I was on, I was on multiple Zoom calls. That was before Zoom. I was in person at some meetings with him and Jeff as they debated this. They debated adding them because they knew that the most successful organizations with Scrum had these values, but they had values, right, that allowed Scrum to develop. They, however, depending on the culture, depending on the environment, depending on, China's very different from Africa, that's very different from London, that's very different from Bosnia, right? Depending on that situation, those values might be slightly different. However, the decision was made to add them primarily because it at least set something in the ground, set a line that said, come on, we really do need to actually think about the culture that Scrum and Agile is being implemented in. And they're these 5 values: courage, the idea that you have the courage to do the right thing and to work on the right problem. Focus, that everyone is focused on that sprint goal. That's actually more important than the sprint backlog, that goal, but we're focusing on it. We're committed not to doing what we said we would do because it's a complex problem. We might not result, but committed to our Scrum team, committed to delivering the value, committed to the goal, trying to achieve that goal, or learning that it's impossible. Now, the last 2 are super important because they're around psychological safety, respect and openness. One thing that we see over and over again from the most successful organizations are that the teams respect each other. They don't have the same skills. They don't come from the same backgrounds. In fact, the most diverse teams are normally the most successful teams, but they respect each other and they trust each other. And they create an environment that allows everybody to see it. The most successful Scrum teams work in an organization that respects the work that they're doing and believes that they're trying to do the best they possibly can based on the environment. So there isn't this sort of like negative tension that we see in lots of, I'm working for you, so I don't trust that you're going to be doing the right thing. And did you have Friday afternoon off? Come on, that kind of stuff. So interestingly, we did a study 2 years ago with McKinsey. This is scrum.org, and you can download this paper from the scrum.org website or from the McKinsey website, where we did it was a relatively small sample, but we found that this same thing happened. That ultimately the most successful Scrum teams, so this was looking at personality traits. So one thing that was super interesting, you know, the magazines that when you're standing in a supermarket line, I'm not sure we do this now, right? We use Instacart or whatever, but when we used to stand in supermarket lines, we used to pick up a magazine like Cosmopolitan, and in it there would be Find Your Perfect Partner, and it would use psychological tests to determine, you know, who you were, and then would say, well, because of that, you shouldn't marry this person, which was always fun, right? We always enjoyed that. I remember that as a 16-year-old, what did I discover? I should have married an accountant. My wife is not an accountant, so it shows you how successful that test was, or maybe my opinions have changed over the last 30 years. But anyway, so these very interesting tests, right? So we used 2 tests. We used the Big Five, the standard personality profile, and we looked at the most successful teams, the kinds of personalities that were on there. And then we looked at work values, so the kind of things that they were aspiring to. And we built out this research from it. There's a few things great about this research. One is it really highlighted some of the things that we were too embarrassed to say. And the second thing is it gave us some great interview questions. There's a really practical guide at the end that provides you with how to interview for it. Not saying that you should only hire people with these personality traits for your Scrum teams, but just that you need to be aware of the impact of the alternate states. The thing that really did annoy me, though, after this research was, as we were writing the paper, I started doing some Googling, and I found that Google did a similar study. And of course, they did. It was a lot bigger sample. It was a lot more data, and it was so successful. It was in the New York Times. My paper wasn't in the New York Times. In the Weekend, the magazine, which comes out on a Sunday, I guess. I guess it does. And they learn a lot around the interesting characteristics around perfect teams. Interestingly enough, they found that psychological safety was the single most important characteristic. It was not super smart people. It was not the skills that they brought, or even the experience that they brought. Those things were important, don't get me wrong, but the most successful teams had an environment that was, they were excited to be there. They felt confident to express their needs. They felt able to express how they felt, and they were honest with each other, which basically meant when they didn't know something, they were honest about it, which allowed them to then focus on this, to, you know, and do it. They also were in an environment that allowed that. So when they went to their stakeholders and said, hey, I know you want to do this, we're not quite sure what it means, what kind of experiments can we build together on that, they were willing to listen. We called it agreeableness, that a unique characteristic that anybody's got that allows them to say yes and, not yes but. Yes and is a much more strong phrase when somebody provides you an opinion than yes but. Because guess what? Every time you hammer them, they will be less willing to provide that opinion in the future and more nervous about how people think of them. So ultimately, values are super important for Scrum to be successful. And over the last 25 years, the organizations that have actually managed to adopt those values, or at least change the behavior of the environment that the teams are in, that the values around, you know, particularly around respect and openness, and that they accept that courage is a good thing, and they don't weaponize those values to make it a very competitive and aggressive environment, are the most successful. The next one is discipline. Now, you know, we all like a bit of discipline. My wife's a personal trainer. Whenever I talk about discipline, she makes me do sit-ups. So I try not to mention discipline in the house. And discipline, very important. What is it? Okay, mindful and systematic, I like to think of it. It's an action or inaction that is regulatory in accordance with a particular system of governance, meaning that we follow the system in and we regulate it. But in how it manifests itself in Scrum teams is that we we're mindful and disciplined in the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And we're very focused on, like, for instance, let's use some examples. Actually, the one I was going to say isn't on here, but the one thing that we get really sloppy at is backlogs become crap logs. That's just the reality. Myself and my CTO were going through Jira, as you do, the other day. And I happened to log on. Normally we just go for it. He screen shares. We're like, yeah, we're going to do this and this priority and blah, 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 blah. And it's all awesome. But I actually logged into Jira, which I haven't done for a while, and actually went through. I was like, what the hell's all this stuff? And so I said to Rye, I said, what the heck's all this stuff? And he goes, oh yeah, I need to keep up my backlog. I was like, well, how do we know what the volume of our work is if we have all this sort of like rubbish in it? That I know that we delivered on that. I know we're not doing that anymore. I know, discipline around the backlog is super important for lots of reasons. One, because if we want the backlog to provide transparency to the work that potentially we could do in the future, if it's full of work that isn't actually going to be the work that we're going to do in the future, then it's very, very, very likely, no surprise, that people, when they look at it, will have to go and talk to somebody, which then is another conversation. I'm not saying conversations are bad, but then it becomes an overhead. It gets in the way of the team focus and etc. That's just one example, management of your backlog. But daily scrum, same time every day. Why is it? The use of the word daily scrum instead of daily stand-up. Why do we do that? Two reasons. One, some people can't stand up. That's not very nice for those people. Secondly, it really isn't. We have a trainer, Dave Dame, who's in a wheelchair, and he's like, oh, so I'm not invited to this then? Which I thought was ironic. And I'm like, God, I never thought of that before. But the second reason is to remind why we're doing it. Remember, a scrum forms in rugby when the ball stops moving. We start the game again, right? We get the game moving. So we've just had the last 24 hours. We may have slowed up. We may not. Let's try focus on the next 24 hours. We meet as a scrum and we move forward. Work comes from the backlog. Done is done. Done is done. Super important. Particularly, it's non-software teams getting that definition in those backlog items to say what it means to finish this card. Super important. WIP limits, obviously, cards describe outcomes, etc., etc. So then the dirty truth is, the problem is the discipline, just like in Kung Fu, I guess, discipline, when I'm talking about discipline, I'm talking about individuals having discipline. A lot of industrial systems, processes, rely on the system providing the discipline. And, that's about it. It's kind of different. So we as individuals must be very disciplined about the work. We can't trust the system to protect us. It's no longer there. It means that we need to be frequently inspecting. It means that we need to trust people, but we need to do things together, pairing and the like. It means that we have to have, definition of done, sprint goals, PBI with success criteria, and everybody is responsible for the discipline of the team. The most disciplined teams are the ones that are most successful. Outcomes. Okay, so we've got a culture, an environment of behaviors that makes sense. This is the future of the most successful Scrum teams, the future of Scrum. We've got these behaviors, and then we're very disciplined. The next one is about outcomes. The reality is that a lot of the work that you deliver adds no value. How embarrassing is that? That sounds awful, right? But that is how we live. I was recently in Germany at a large pharmaceutical company, and I was doing teaching a training class, which I rarely do, and you shouldn't recommend it. I tend to get sidetracked too easily. But what was interesting is I was chatting to this guy, and I was like, they do an SAP. They manage the distribution of the pharmaceuticals to the supply chain, basically through an SAP implementation. I said, how many people in your organization, in your department? He goes, oh, over 100. I was like, that's super interesting. What percentage are developers? They said, oh, we don't have any developers in our team. I was like, well, hang on a minute. So what are you doing every day? Well, there's 100 people. We do this. We write up reports. We do. I was like, wow. Now, ultimately, everything that we should do should be directly focused to delivering value. And you can imagine that that isn't the case. And an outcome is how we express that value. It's some sort of state experienced by the user of a product. Now, the thing that's really, really interesting is that the value is in the context of a human being. So one thing that I think the future of Scrum will definitely be more connected to, and we did this with our professional Scrum with UX, worked with our friends at Lean UX, Jeff and Josh. Awesome book, by the way. It fundamentally changed how I write backlog items when I spent 2 days with them on a training class. And obviously read the book before that. But one thing that I see is that the connection to outcomes and the connection to users. So I, before COVID, had the benefit of traveling the world, talking to people, right? It was awesome. And I went to visit lots of Scrum teams, which was awesome, awesome. Loved it. And I remember many of the teams had great burn down charts on the wall. They even had team working agreements. That was great. I thought, that's awesome. Very few had customers on the wall, in their next to their Scrum boards and the like. Very few of them clearly articulated the value to their customer. Very few of them wrote the user stories in the context of a customer. Very few of them expressed the sprint goal in terms of the outcomes to the customer. Now, it was really, really interesting is when I asked many of these teams, mates, people that are in the teams, developers, I guess I should call them, and said, hey, many of them had a different view of who the customer was and why they were doing that. That was worrying. Remember Dan Pink, autonomy, mastery, purpose? Purpose is one of the most important motivators for any team. Customers provide purpose. Now, you might say, I work for an insurance company. I work on legacy systems. That's awfully dull. But remember why we do insurance? We deliver insurance so that the risks of many, basically the risks of small groups are managed by the risks of many. We ultimately spread the risk. That's an awesome job to do. Build software for those people or build products for those people. That's cool. Everything that we do has a value in society and has people that benefit from it. Let's express that. If you're a product owner on this talk today, remember to start explicitly communicating customers to your teams. If you're in a team, spend a lot of questions asking, why is there a satisfaction gap? What is that? Because remember, the other thing about agility is it's the art of the possible. We don't necessarily know how we're going to implement stuff. So that gives us incredible free rein if we better understand the value of the thing that we're trying to do, the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Now, this has been sort of brought into a whole life cycle now. This is a Gartner model. It should have that reference. I apologize, Gartner. This is Gartner's description of how design thinking, lean startup, and Scrum. They didn't dare say Scrum because that would be a methodology. Even though it's not, they don't like to, say one thing. So we've got design thinking, lean startup, Scrum working together. This idea of understanding the custom, understanding the opportunity, and then the execution model. I don't like this model. I mean, I do and I don't. I like the fact and I appreciate that the future is going to be these three things working together, but I think of it more as a continuous model. The fact that I know when I was a product owner at TaskTop and I was working with my teams, the most exciting, every sprint, we did a bit of H1, which is the current work, a bit of H2, which is the next release, and then a bit of H3. And throughout, we were doing design thinking, we were testing, validating new hypotheses around the business, and we were obviously doing Scrum. So think how you can take advantage of these three things and bring them together to build an empirical approach to delivering value for your organization. That is what agility is all about. It's about understanding the customer and delivering value to them incrementally in an empirical way. That requires design thinking, lean startup type thinking, and obviously something like Scrum. The last one is around community. I'm conscious of the time because I'd love to have some time to ask questions at the end, as I haven't managed to get to Bosnia, so I'm a little grumpy about that. So maybe we can talk instead. So the last one is really how I see scaling happening. So we have some fantastic scaling frameworks. Nexus, great book written by myself on it, by the book. Actually, all the proceeds of the book go to a fabulous charity. So buy the book. So Nexus, Less, Safe, Dad, the Spotify model, all of this stuff. Great ideas, right? About scaling. But you know, when I see scaling happening, really, I see people learning stuff. I see people actually asking a question unto themselves of not what have I done today, but who have I helped? This idea ultimately of scaling the ideas requires people to work together. Now, the most famous way of doing that is this idea that you are the Spotify model, right? This is a fantastic idea, but if you step back from the words, which are fabulous, and remember that that squad used to be called Scrum Team back in the day, and they still have Scrum Masters, which is interesting. So, however, the Spotify model approached something really interesting. They said we need to group teams together to focused on customers via products. They called those tribes. And each one of those had this, had these squads working together on that. Your bonus was paid on that contribution to your outcomes, right? But you were supported because remember, you might be the only UX person in a tribe even, or certainly in a squad, or the only front end developer. So you were in a chapter and maybe a guild that allowed you to become better at your skill, and time was provided for you to support that. This idea of skill-based communities where professional development is the responsibility and ultimately your promotion isn't based on your business contribution directly. It's actually based on your how many people you've developed and your contribution to that community. And reward is tied to status, and reward therefore is tied to mastery. Wouldn't it be great if we built organizations where though you had a set of skills that you were brought in for and you were working on a team exploring and executing those skills, that there was a community supporting you that cared about those skills getting better, that you had time to help others that were less mature and had less experience with the things that you know, that everybody becomes a teacher, everybody trains everybody mentors other people, because not only does that make for a better, more scalable set of ideas, but it also makes for a better human being. My life is much more rich when I spend time doing training and teaching people and helping others and spending time. I make a percentage of my time every month that I actually give to other people and help them. Now, there is no skill-based community for me to be a part of. I'm not going to get promoted, but it's the most rewarding time. I was on Friday morning, I had a call with somebody that I guess, mentoring. It sounds awful to say it like that because she's teaching me as much as I'm learning from her. And we talked about the Scrum Master role. We talked about, how do you get managers to understand it? And she runs the Scrum Masters at a medical software organization. It's so enriching to do this, and we need to build this into our organizations to allow that to happen. Now, the Spotify model is becoming rapidly, one of the most de facto kind of ways of organizing. And I know Spotify themselves say, hey, we don't do that anymore. And it doesn't matter. Look at it. Use the learning of this idea of decoupling the work management, the business management from the skills and people management in a way that allows the enrichment of like-minded people and the development of them, professional development of them. I'm super excited about that. Okay. One more thing. Isn't that what a very famous Steve Jobs would say? So before I go on to one more thing, we talked about culture. We talked about, which is the values and the like. They don't have to be the Scrum values, but they have to mean something for you, and they have to create the outcomes that those Scrum values create. We talked about discipline. It's super important to be, the most successful organizations will continuously add the discipline to their practices. And increasingly discipline is whether it's trunk-based development, if you're a software team, test-driven development, or whether it's, writing clear outcomes, if you're a marketing team using this, discipline becomes super important. Stay true to that, continuously monitor that, and I guess it's connected to continuous improvement. Then we talked a lot about outcomes and the importance of outcomes, and the fact that we need to reframe our backlog. I spend a lot of time reframing my backlog based on the experience of learning from the Lean UX guys and our professional Scrum with UX class, because I was like, hang on a minute, these are tasks. These don't describe the outcome I'm achieving. They give no flexibility to my team to do it. I've made design decisions in them. I got to stop doing that. And I've tried to do that. And the last thing really is giving back. The fact that we need to build organization construct that takes the people side, the professional development side, with peers. This isn't a HR or a line management responsibility. Creates an environment of peers where they can develop each other to become better at their craft. Now, that's the future of Scrum. If those things all work together, you can imagine what an amazing place is. But how will we know it's an amazing place? How do we know that we're there yet, Al? How do we know if we've actually delivered value? Well, I'm afraid that's measurement. And we've been working on this stuff called EBM, which some of you may be aware of. And I don't care if you use EBM, but ultimately start thinking about the outcomes at the product level and at the organization level that are going to make the most sense to you. And it's your responsibility as Scrum teams and Scrum Masters and Agile coaches to drive clear values into the organization to allow you to be empirical. And it's possible you'll pick the wrong ones, but that's a great thing about frequent observation and empiricism, that if you pick the wrong one, you can change it, you can improve it. Isn't that cool? Marvelous, hey? So we believe in four values, two of which are very much focused outside looking. And of course, the metrics will be different depending on your situation. But current value, what is the current value of the product delivering? That could be revenue, it could be customer satisfaction, it could be how many people are looking at it, are using it. What measures the success currently of your product? And then how much is unrealized? What is the potential? How many insurance claims can we be handling? How little, what is the opportunity that we have? How little time does a claims adjuster have to spend if we improve, whatever those things are, if you're in insurance. I don't know why I picked insurance today. That's probably the most boring, but it's good. It's important, right? And then the second set of measures are around organizational capability, ability to innovate, and time to market. These are two super important things. If you have to pick one, focus on time to market, by the way. That cycle time, that time, how long does it take you to get stuff out? I think the most successful organizations are the ones that can deliver rapidly to market frequently. Obviously, Amazon is the famous one, but Netflix is also pretty famous. And they've done some crazy ass practices around DevOps and the like, and some of their business practices to make that happen. The other thing, though, is the ability to innovate. You can be delivering to market frequently, but all you're doing is bug fixing or infrastructure upgrades. Your systems and your processes might be completely out of date and are continuously, security patch 1, security patch 2, security. Oh, we've got to do some compliance stuff, some more compliance stuff, yet more compliance stuff. So how much of that work in your Jira backlogs or whatever, or your team's backlogs or whatever tool you're using, how much of that work is actually innovation? So start tagging some of those things. And you'll be surprised by how much work is actually new value, innovative work that you're doing. If you start building these measures and putting them in place, what you'll find is you'll start being able to effectively run those organizational type retrospectives or those product like retrospectives, and it will help you reframe your product roadmap, look at where waste is happening in your organization, and be more effective at improving the outcomes and the ultimate value that your products and capabilities are delivering to market. So let's put that all together, the future of Scrum. In my opinion, 25 years ago, by luck or by judgment, Ken and Jeff stumbled on something pretty amazing. which was presented today, 25 years ago, in Austin, Texas. It focused on three things: empiricism, empowered teams, and improvement. The framework, the artifacts, the roles all embody that. However, to be successful with that requires you to basically focus on four other things: discipline, outcomes in the context of customers, values, and doing things for other people, helping them learn and get better. Dare I call that community? You do that in the context of time to market, ability to innovate, current value and unreal value. Use that as the empirical measure to get that feedback. You're in an amazing position to change the world. Now, I thought that's what I wanted to talk about today. Obviously, I can't see anybody or hear anybody, so I'm going to stop sharing. Hopefully, this has been interesting. I want one last story, actually. Before I go, there's a story that I just want to share with you, a story that has a very personal impact of the success and the power of Agile and Scrum. There's a Scrum Master that works at the Broad Institute. The Broad Institute is an institute in Cambridge that did genome, map the human genome, all that kind of famous stuff. Yeah. When COVID hit, there's a Scrum Master there who said, hang on a minute, we can do genetic testing. I mean, we do it all the time, right? We're pretty good at it. So she built in 5 days with a team a COVID test lab in an environment that never had a COVID test lab. They did it. Yeah, they may have used Scrum, they used Kanban, they may have used, I don't really care how they did it. In 5 days, they built a fully functioning COVID test lab when the rest of the country was having some challenges with testing. And maybe that's not the case in Bosnia, but in the US, that certainly has been the case. Now, 6 months comes and schools go back. My son, I've got 2 sons. My eldest goes to a school where he's only going to school, physical school, 1 or 2 days a week, that he does virtually all virtual learning. And it's a nightmare, not going to lie. My other son goes to school every day. He's 4, he's in pre-K. The school that he goes to use the Broad Institute's tests. And because of that, they've been able to keep the school open. In-person learning. My son's 4, so you can imagine virtual isn't going to be great for him. The reason why I tell this story, and I know we haven't got time for answers, I probably have one question at the end, sorry, I apologize, is because the art of the possible. The reason why Scrum is so valuable isn't the artifacts, the framework and that, it's the outcomes that it delivers and the mindset that it creates in the people that apply it. That lady at the Broad Institute has changed my life. She really has, by having that test capability, by having the ability to test those students and those faculty members. What we've done is my son now is getting an education, which he probably wouldn't have if it wasn't for that. Scrum changed my life in a very practical way in the last 6 months. Maybe it's changed yours as well. I'm looking forward to the next 25 years of Scrum. Thank you for your time. Oh, I'm going to stop sharing now.